Welcome to Back Pocket Universe. I'm Elliot, and I am going to be reviewing another vintage paperback sci-fi book. Today I am reviewing The Case Against Tomorrow by Frederik Pohl. This is a collection of short stories that are taken from stories that Frederik Pohl published in science fiction magazines in the mid-1950s. This book completely fell apart as I was reading it. It's a total mess, unfortunately. I try to be careful with these, but there didn't seem to be anything that I could do to prevent this one from really disintegrating as I read it. That's kind of the nature of the beast, unfortunately. When we buy these books, they probably haven't been opened or read in a long time. The table of contents for this book includes the Midas Plague, the Census Takers, the Candlelighter, the celebrated no-hit inning, Wapshot's Demon, and My Lady Greensleeves. So I'm going to give you a brief summary of each of these stories and then share a few of my thoughts with you, although I'm sure I'll intersperse some commentary along the way as well. The first story in the book is the Midas Plague. It depicts a future in which robot automation has advanced to a point that society is literally overabundant. The concept is paradoxical in nature. People in a lower strata of society are given consumption quotas that they have to meet, or they risk being penalized with higher consumption quotas, meaning the more poor you are, the more stuff you have. The more poor you are, the more you have to consume as a consequence of being poor in that society. Sparseness then is seen as an indicator of wealth in this story. The story centers on a character named Maury Fry, who is struggling to make his wife, who comes from a higher strata of society, happy. In the process, he unwittingly stumbles upon a solution to the consumption problem by programming their household robots to consume for them. The premise is hard to believe, but what is equally hard to believe is how poignant the premise is to the society in which we live today in certain ways. So I thought that was pretty interesting. There are parallels to our society in this story that may not have been true when Frederik Pohl wrote it, I would suspect. The second story is The Census Takers. The Census Takers, it's an odd little story. It takes place in a terrifying dystopia in which overpopulation is managed with mechanically draconian efficiency. The end of this system is heralded by the emergence of creatures or people who live in the center of the earth. The story is 7 pages long, and these two interesting ideas are not sufficiently explored in the space of the story as far as I'm concerned. I read it before going to sleep at night, and it didn't leave much of an impression on me at all. The next story is called The Candlelighter. Um, this is a story about a well-meaning human activist for Martian causes. And the activist ends up being made administrator of human affairs on Mars. So he gets an opportunity to put his ideology into action. And in the process, he finds that imposing his own ideas and morals on the Martians doesn't work the way that he expected because they're fundamentally different from humans. I had mixed feelings about this story. Um, on one hand, it's a very interesting examination of how empathy is not the same thing as a real understanding of the complexity of a situation. Empathy is good, but it's not everything. On another hand, humanity's role in solving the problems that the Martians have, to me, felt somewhat contrived and convenient, and um, there is a sort of a forced imperialistic quality to the story that I think that Pohl was probably intentionally trying to avoid and just didn't quite manage it. The next story in the collection is the celebrated no-hit inning. It's about a baseball player named Boley whose talent is surpassed only by his ego. He's taken to the future, which is 1999. In case you didn't know, 1999 was and continues to be the future. Anyway, in 1999, baseball is a very different game from the one that he's familiar with, and so he gets a lesson in humility. I don't know anything about baseball, despite the fact that it is theoretically my favorite sport. So that tells you, you know, how much I know about sports. I would suspect that uh, a baseball player from the 1950s would find a modern game of baseball to be almost equally confusing. The only other thing I have to say about this story is that if baseball really did have robot players in 1999, I might have started following it more closely. That is, by the way, what the cover of the book is based on. You see these two two robots fighting over baseball. It's not by any means a literal interpretation of the story, but that's where the cover comes from. And this cover, was whimsical and interesting, and definitely caught my attention. And that's one of the reasons why I bought this book. The next story is Wapshot's Demon. Wapshot's Demon is inspired by the famous thought experiment Maxwell's Demon. It has to do with creating perpetual energy by separating hot and cold air currents. And in the story, the main character creates a sort of fortune-telling device using a similar process of dividing yes and no answers. I found the concept to be quite stretched and didn't really get it. And it was a short enough story that it didn't leave a strong impression on me either way. The final story in the collection is My Lady Greensleeves. This is a dystopian story. It takes place in a society that is built around very strict class stratifications. It depicts a prison in which the inmates are people who dared to break the boundaries of their class. For example, a mechanic who asked a clerk out on a date, or an architect who dared indulge in some oil painting on the side. Um, it's written during a time, of course, when segregation in the United States was common, and I strongly suspect that in this case, Pohl was using class, at least partially, as an analog for race. There are a lot of observations in the story that continue to be relevant today, and I'll talk about that in my opinions in a minute. And having read the story, it certainly left an impression on me, and I can't quite decide whether he was talking more about literal class stratifications or whether he was talking more about race, but he was making really interesting observations about both. So, what did I like about this book? Well, there were a lot of thought-provoking ideas in it, some more thought-provoking than others, some more believable than others. I found the book to be both enjoyable and a little bit jarring because of its mixture of whimsical, lighthearted concepts and very dark, heavy dystopian concepts. Sometimes, as we move from story to story, but also within the context of stories themselves. And Pohl has an interesting way of sometimes, though not always, presenting very disturbing concepts in a rather whimsical way, which is sometimes appropriate for the sake of effect and sometimes isn't. What did I not like about the book? Well, there was very little space travel. And, you know, when I pick up a science fiction paperback, I like some space travel. They're not all about space travel, of course. But the reason I'm bringing that up is I recently read The Space Merchants by Frederik Pohl. And now take a look at this cover here. What do you see? You see a man and a woman in a spaceship and a book called The Space Merchants. And so I picked up this book with every expectation of reading a book about some kind of space travel. And no, no, there's very little space travel in this book. And while the book was very interesting and apparently true to Pohl's form, it had lots of interesting observations about society and class and social stratification and consumerism, no space travel, pretty much none. And so I'm just wondering what's up with this, Mr. Pohl? We are a science fiction author, are we not? Why don't we write a little bit more about space travel? I don't know. My expectations were somewhat dashed with this book, despite the fact that in the end I liked it. I suppose I just got that stuck in my craw. It's not much of a critique, and it certainly doesn't make the case against tomorrow not worth reading if you happen to get a copy of it. But that's what I have to say about that, dearly beloved Mr. Pohl. So, what's the big idea? Wow, there are a lot of ideas that can be pulled out of this collection of stories, which is appropriate for a collection of sci fi stories. One would think that there are. The theme, the common theme that I got from it had a lot to do with class and social stratification, and in some cases, race. So the two stories that really most caught my attention were the Midas Plague and My Lady Greensleeves, but also to a large extent, um, what was it? The candle lighter, the one about the Martian activist. Um, in that story, we have a very well-meaning activist who cares about these Martians, but he hasn't had enough real interaction with them to really understand how it is they function and how it is their society function. And so when he goes in and tries to make changes to the way in which humans are interacting with Martians, he ends up causing a bigger problem than the humans had originally created. And in this case, the story strongly indicates that humans, in a certain way, are sort of the Martians' saviors, which come across as imperialistic. But at the same time, it does have some interesting things to say about the presumptions that we can make about people that we don't really understand. And I found that to be thought provoking. It's one thing to care about someone, especially just to care about someone as a class or a group. It's another thing to really get an understanding of their world that's deep enough to be effective in some way, assuming that one even has a role to play in their world per se at all. And these observations about social and sometimes racial divisions are a consistent theme in Pohl's stories. And I get the impression that it's something that he cared a lot about. Going back to the Space Merchants, this is the only other book that I think I've read by Pohl so far, and I'm sure I'll read more. And that also had very strict class stratifications represented in the story, and some very biting commentary on consumerism. And of course, the Midas Plague, the first story in this collection, had a lot to say about consumerism. That was the main point of the story. And I find an interesting parallel between the rather comical concept presented in the story. I mean, it's initially really hard to wrap one's mind around the idea that the poor people in a society would be the people with more cars, more houses, more clothing, and more stuff in general. And yet, we find that there are not dissimilar parallels in our own society. If you compare the typical lifestyle of someone on the lower end of our economy with the typical lifestyle of someone on the higher end of our economy, while both are consumers in our society, there is a sense of overconsumption among the lower strata that can be easily observed by walking into any Walmart. And the one of the hallmarks of being in the higher strata of society is having more control over what we consume and how we consume it. And the premise of this story was that for poor people, control was taken out of their hands. They were given quotas in which they had to consume a certain amount or be penalized. And while there isn't that sort of top down imposition represented in our society in a literal way, it is clear to see to me that there is a sort of uh, Im- implied imposition, that the way our society is structured, um, people on the lower end of society, almost more than people on the higher end, are given the role of consumers and are pressed to fulfill it. And I did find that to be very interesting. And as someone who lives, sort of in the middle of that range, lower middle maybe, I find overconsumption to be a consistent problem. I'm someone who personally tends to lean minimalist, and yet a continual problem in my life is the acquisition of too much stuff over time. In a similar way, My Lady Greensleeves, the final story in the collection, has some really interesting parallels in our society. I'm gonna maybe I'll read a quick passage that really caught my attention um, from that. It's just one paragraph. It says, "For punishment is a crime not satisfied by a jail sentence. How does it hurt a man to feed and clothe and house him with the bills paid by the state? Lafan's punishment was that he, as an architect, was through. Savage tribes used to lop off a finger or an ear to punish a criminal. Civilized societies confine their amputations to bits and pieces of the personality. Chop, chop, and a man's reputation comes off. Chop again, and his professional standing is gone. Chop, chop, and he has lost the respect and trust of his fellows. The jail itself isn't the punishment. The jail is only the shaman's hatchet that performs the amputation. If rehabilitation in jail worked, if it was meant to work, it would be the end of jails." You know, that Pohl could sort of took an opportunity to make a really, I think, direct and personal imposition in the text there, and it for me was very effective. He makes his point well, and it is a very biting commentary, both on the society of his day and the society of ours. We find ourselves in a society in which, as I suppose would be expected, the population of prisons is largely representative of certain classes and certain races. And whatever you have to say about it, it's true. And so these stories got me thinking a lot about the various divisions that we have between races and classes and segregated groups in general, and the ways in which we try to navigate those in this society. It was different in the 1950s when Pohl was writing the stories than it is now. But some of the observations are still directly true, and some of them have interesting parallels that I suppose in some ways are even more poignant than they might have been at the time that the book was written. It it got me thinking a lot about classes, about marginalization, about the way in which marginalized people are viewed, in which we are tempted to view ourselves or other people as marginalized in ways that may not be truly helpful to them or to ourselves, and may not represent a true understanding of the complexities involved. We do live in a society that, even though it's not necessarily dystopian in the sense that class divisions are imposed top down in a draconian way, we still find ourselves navigating those class distinctions all the time. It occurred to me as I was reading the story, uh, I have a little bit of experience with the foster care system in the United States, and it occurs to me that from my personal experience, when a child transitions into the foster care system, in many cases, that child is transitioned from one class to another class by necessity. You would almost never get a scenario, for example, in which a child from a wealthy family ends up in the foster care system and is then cared for by a less wealthy family, right? It almost always goes the other way around, where there are certain classes that have certain systemic problems that they seem to be unable to fully lick or haven't licked yet. And as a result, these things happen. And one of the consequences of these things happening is that in some cases, their children are shifted from one class in society to another class in society. And I'm not going to go into that in depth, but it was something that occurred to me as I was reading the stories. And I really appreciated that this book got me thinking about things like that and approached class and race and position and social stratification from so many different interesting angles. So if you happen to find an opportunity to read any of these stories or pick up a copy of this book, I definitely recommend it. This book, unfortunately, is trashed. So I'm just going to put it on my shelf and hope that it doesn't deteriorate further. The next book that I'm going to review is Changeling Earth by Fred Saberhagen. Jury's still very much out on this one, but I am not quite halfway through it now, and we'll see what I have to say about it in a week. Until then, thanks for watching, and be seeing you.